Beis Amud Beis is Daf Samach Gimel, 62b, and the Gemara went through the mission of the two obligations, the two goats being the same, and where that source is. Now that we have a brisa teaching us in relation to that, the Torah gives a prohibition for any korban that's a valid korban that's supposed to be brought to the Beis Hamikdash, and it wasn't brought to the Beis Hamikdash. Rather, it was brought to outside of the Beis Hamikdash anywhere, and shechted there. There's a severe prohibition of shchutei chutz, shechting a korban outside of the Beis Hamikdash where it's supposed to be brought. The caveat is it has to be able and valid to be brought to the Beis Hamikdash. But if it is not valid in the Beis Hamikdash, so then it's not shchutei chutz, a shechting of a korban outside of Beis Hamikdash, because it wasn't appropriate for the Beis Hamikdash. Tana Rabban. So the Brisa taught Shnei Seirei Yom Kippurim, the two goats of Yom Kippur, sheshachtan machutz, he shechted them outside of the Beis Hamikdash, which it would be a Torah prohibition because this is supposed to be a korban brought inside the Beis Hamikdash. Actually, hikrel aliyah. If he had not yet made the lottery, the Kohen Gadol had not yet made the lottery on this, so therefore, either of them could be the one that's the korban. So chayiv al shneim, he's going to be held responsible for both of them because both were valid as a korban, and he didn't bring it as a korban into the Beis Hamikdash, but rather he shechted it outside of the Beis Hamikdash. So he's going to be held responsible either way. Well, once he already did the girl, he did the lottery on them, and they've been designated, one as Lashem, and one as Azazel, one being a korban and one being sent out into the desert. Chayiv al shel shem, the one that he shechted that would have and should have been a korban in the Beis Hamikdash, and he brought it outside the Beis Hamikdash, for that one he's going to be held responsible. Pater al Azazel, the one that's being sent out to Azazel, the shechting of that outside the Beis Hamikdash, he will be exempt of, because that's not really a korban that's being sent out to be pushed off the hill. Yeah.
Page, position, please.
62b, last lines of 62b.
Thank you.
Actually, so now the Gemara is going to challenge the first assumption that prior to the lottery, both of them are going to be a valid, worthy of being a valid korban, because either of them could be the goat, and that's going to be brought as a korban, and therefore he's going to be held responsible for both. So Gemara says, why? How are they able to be brought as a korban? In the meantime, they're actually not able to be brought as a korban because you still have to do a set of things: the goat, the bull, and then the lottery, and then the shechting of the bull, and the incense. For this to be a valid korban requires many different steps. So actually, it's not worthy of a korban yet, and therefore shechting it outside should not be the transgression of shchutei chutz, of bringing korban outside. Amar Rav Chisda. So Rav Chisda says you're right. As it is, what it was intended to be, it's not yet worthy of a korban. However, you could bring it as a regular goat, which is supposed to be brought out in Yom Kippur as a part of the korban of the day. That is a part of what it's worthy of. You could have brought that. So he says, so what? That also is not true. Because what's the reason we say, it can't be brought as its own korban, as the goat that it's meant to be, a part of the lottery? Why can't it be brought? The mechusah agrala is still lacking many steps. It has to have the lottery done, and then it has to have the bulls brought and spritzed and so on. There's a specific place for it in the avodah, the service of the day, and you haven't reached that spot. Well, the Sarah Nasa B'chutz Nami Lo Chazi, the Mechasi Avedis Hayir. So too, the carbon of the day also has its the Musaf also has its particular avodah and its particular place, and it's not worthy of that yet. The Gemara says, "Kasavar of Chisda ein mechuser zman l'chayvi." Rav Chisda says there's a distinction. What's the problem by the goat that of the two goats that's meant as the atonement goat, the chatas? That goat actually requires avodah steps. There are still things you need to do, whereas the musaf, it's just time. You have to wait for a specific point of the day in order to do it. L'boy b'yoyim, in the same day, there's no mechuser zman. The fact that it's lacking time doesn't count as not worthy of a carbon. This idea of mechuser zman, that it's not worthy of a carbon yet, is the concept that if carbon pesach, right? It's a true carbon, but you can't bring it today. You have to wait until the correct time, the Erev Pesach. So unless you're on that day, it's mechuser zman. It's lacking time, right? It's not the correct time. It's not a valid carbon. And as we said, it would have to be a valid carbon in the Beis Hamikdash in order for you to be transgressing the shchutei chutz to shecht it outside of the Beis Hamikdash. However, over here, if it's mechuser zman, that the time hasn't come yet for it to be a carbon, and therefore it's not going to be valid. That's true if it's any other day of the year. But on that day itself, meaning Yom Kippur, for the Musaf of Yom Kippur, true, you still have to wait some time till you bring the carbon. That's okay, but there aren't actually specific mitzvahs that it's dependent upon. It's mechuser zman. It's just time. Based on this, what Rav Chisda is saying, that the fact that it requires the lottery is not just time. That's actually a maisa. It's missing in action. Whereas the Muslim is just waiting for the correct time. Based on that, this is what Rav Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel. Shlamim, sheshachta kodesh sheniftachu dalses ahil. The shlamim offering, which is a korban, which it could be brought any day, really. So it's brought, but it was brought prior to the doors of the Beis Hamikdash opening. Psulim, they're going to be invalid. Hoil shenema, because it says v'shachtu pesach al mayim. It says, and you will shecht it at the opening of the tent of meeting. Bizman shu pesuach means that the Beis Hamikdash has to be open. You can't just bring it to the Beis Hamikdash and shecht it. It has to be brought at the time that the Beis Hamikdash is open. The doors are open. V'lo bizman shu no, and not at the time that it's closed. And that is a mitzvah, and therefore we now go to Samach Gimel Amud Aleph. Therefore, if somebody brings a carbon that's supposed to be brought inside, and he shechts it outside of the Beis Hamikdash, he shechts it at home, whatever it is, but it's prior to the doors of the Beis Hamikdash opening, meaning this carbon is now not valid, because even if you brought it to the Beis Hamikdash at this moment, it would not be valid, because it's mechuser ma'aseh, it's lacking in action. There's a particular deed that needs to be done first, which is opening the doors. Shachtam b'chutz, if he shechts it outside of Beis Hamikdash, kodev she'niftachu dalses ha'hechel, before the doors of the hechel of the Beis Hamikdash open, pati is going to be exempt. My timer, mechusa pasicha, it's lacking opening, and that is mechusa ma'aseh davi. It's like it's lacking a specific action that needs to be done. So to review, we have the mitzvah of bringing a carbon to the Beis Hamikdash and bringing it as the carbon it's meant to be. The prohibition that if it is valid as a carbon now, bringing it and shechting it anywhere outside of the space that it's meant to be. That's shchutei chutz. Shechting it even on the Temple Mount, outside of the courtyard, off the Temple Mount, at home, anywhere. That's going to be the prohibition. But the caveat is it has to be valid as a carbon now. So Rav Chisda made a distinction and said if it's valid as a carbon on that day, in the Beis Hamikdash, and nothing else is needed. You just wait for the time and you bring it. So any shechting that at home would be the transgression of shchutei chutz, of shechting it outside the Beis Hamikdash. However, if it needs another step in order to be valid as a carbon, whether in every day just opening the door, on the goat of Yom Kippur doing the Hagrala, the lottery, that's going to be invalid because it actually is missing a step, and something has to be done. So then, what's the reason over here that this goat is going to be, if he brings the two goats prior to the lottery, then it's going to count as if he actually shechted it, a valid carbon outside of Beis Hamikdash. He said, you're right, as the goat of the lottery, as the sire, Lazazel, or the sire Lashem, the goat for Hashem, that's not going to be valid because it's still missing steps. It's the Hagrala, the lottery, it's the goat, the bull, the incense. There's steps needed. However, it requires a step for itself, for the goat, to make it valid. And that's Machus Maisa, an action in the goat itself. That's going to count as invalid. So then why then is he held responsible? Because we say, yes, true, it's not valid for its own thing, but I could just swap it out and make it into the Musaf of the day. And the Musaf of the day, it's valid as is. True, it has to wait for some things to happen. It has to wait for the correct time, but that's Machus Zmala by the Yod. It's missing time, but it's in that day. So within that day, it's valid. So essentially, as itself, as a goat for the lottery, it's missing the lottery. That's an action to itself. It's an action that's missing. So why is it chayiv? Because he can bring it as something else. This is called hayib. Since if he wanted to, he could bring it. He could bring this as a different carbon. So he's going to be held responsible even though he has not brought it as a different carbon. Now the Gemara is going to challenge that idea. Umi islay l'Rav Chisda hayil, third line of Samach Gimel Amud Aleph is 63. Mi islay l'Rav Chisda hayil. Does Rav Chisda really have this concept that even though that it isn't valid right now for itself, but if he wanted to, he could have made it valid as something else? That it's going to count as a valid carbon if you bring it outside of the Beis Hamikdash, outside of the Azara, you're going to be chayiv, liable for shchutei chutz, shechting it outside. But Rav Chisda had said, Pesach sheshachta b'chutz. He shechted a Pesach outside of the Beis Hamikdash. Now, the Pesach, when is its correct day? Only on the 14th day of Nisan in the afternoon. However, we've learned when we learned Psachim that every other day of the year, it is valid if you bring it as a shlamim. If you bring it as a regular shlamim, because Pesach is within the shlamim family of karbanos. So if you bring it as a shlamim, it's going to count as a valid carbon all year round. So Pesach, he brings this carbon Pesach, he shechts it outside, which is a prohibition. B'shar Yom HaShana, the rest of the days of the year, meaning not Erev Pesach, L'shmoy, he brings it as a Pesach. Now that's incorrect. It's not valid today as a Pesach. Potter, so he's going to be exempt and won't be held liable for bringing the carbon outside of the Pesach. Shaloi L'shmoy. However, if he brings it not as a Pesach, he brings it as a Shlamim, which is what it is valid as today, Chayiv, he's going to be held liable. Now, the reason that he's exempt, if he brought it Shaloi L'shmoy, time in the Shaloi L'shmoy, he brought it for the wrong intent, he brought it as a Shlamim. Hastama, but if he brought it without any intent, what would we say? L'shmoy, it's going to count as a Pesach. Upater, it's going to be exempt. V'amai. Why? In our case, by the goat, he said he's going to be held liable because, well, he could have made it into the daily musaf, the Yom Kippur musaf, well, but he didn't, right? Over here by the Pesach, we say he could have brought it as a shlamim, yeah, but he didn't, since he's going to be exempt. Yet over here, he's going to say by the goat, he's going to be chayiv. Why? It is worthy as a shlamim, not for its sake, meaning not as a Pesach, bifnim, and so inside, and so he should be held liable for bringing it outside. Someone says, so the Gemara makes a distinction, and this is a discussion in regards to the Karban Pesach. The rest of the days of the year, um, the Pesach is valid as a shlamim. However, it requires that you remake it into a shlamim. You have to say, I'm bringing this as a shlamim, or this is a shlamim. You have to remake it. Without that, it doesn't automatically become a shlamim. Whereas over here, even though you brought this as the goat to be brought inside, which is the atonement goat, but it doesn't require uprooting. Why? Because the goat that's brought as lashem, the pair as a part of the pair, and requires the hagrolo, the lottery, that's a chatas, a sin offering. The musaf is also a sin offering. The goats, either of the reasons you bring this goat, would be as a sin offering, and so you're changing it from one sin offering of today to another sin offering of today, from chatas to chatas. You don't need akira, you don't have to uproot it. So Rav Chisda says, if it doesn't require uprooting, it automatically could be considered as if you brought in something that's valid today. And if you shecht it outside of Beis Hamikdash, you have liable. If you bring it Pesach the rest of the year, you're moving it from a Pesach to Shlamim, even though they're related. It's in the same family of Karbanos, but it isn't the same. So it requires, Akira requires a intentional uproot. Rabbi Bar Simi Masal Abed Rabbi. Rabbi Bar Simi taught the same teaching, but in the name of Rabbi. Instead of Rav Chisda, he quoted Rabbi. V'kashale the Rabbi, and he asked a question from Rabbi on himself about the Korban Pesach. And he answered as he answered. So the same conversation, but in the name of someone else, in the name of Rabbi. Okay. We see many times Rav Dimi would travel from Eretz Yisrael to Babel and back to the academies to teach the teachings of the academy one to the other. So when Rav Dimi came to Babel, he came back to Babel, so he quoted the teaching of Rabbi Yirmiyah in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Pesach, sheshachta b'chutz, the Korban Pesach that he shechted outside of Beis Hamikdash, a big no-no, as we see. B'shari Masashana, but it's the rest of the days of the year which is not valid to bring in Korban Pesach. However, it is valid as a shlamim. Nevertheless, Rabbi Yochanan said, "Bein l'shmai, whether you brought it as a Korban Pesach, bein shaloi l'shmai, whether you brought it as a shlamim, patur, you're going to be exempt. You would be exempt now, even though this korban is valid as a shlamim today. He just swaps it into a shlamim, and he did. He intended it as a shlamim, but he shechted it outside of the Beis Hamikdash. It's not going to count. Amar Avdimi. So Avdimi said, he quoted this, and then he said, Amrit l'shmat kamei Rabbi Yirmiyah. And I repeated this to Rabbi Yirmiyah, and I asked him, B'shlama l'shmai, and he said, I get this. If he brought it as a Korban Pesach, and today it's 2 months after Pesach, makes no sense, right? That's not going to count. Right? It's not valid as a korban, and if it's not valid as a korban in the Beis Hamikdash, he's not going to be liable for bringing it outside of the Beis Hamikdash. Ela shalei l'shmai, but if he brings it as a shlamim, meaning not in the correct intent as a Pesach, but he brings it as a shlamim, amai, why is he going to be exempt? Hachazi, it is valid today. If he brought this into the Beis Hamikdash today as a shlamim, it would be a valid korban. Now that he shechted it at home as a shlamim, that should be considered bringing a korban that's valid today as a outside of the Beis Hamikdash. It's valid as a shlamim inside the Beis Hamikdash. Amar Li responded to me, yeah, it's true. But we just said the halacha is that it requires akira, uprooting from what the korban is and redefining it as another korban. Great. Where did he do this redefining it? Not in the Beis Hamikdash, not in the Azara. He did this at home. Akira's chutz l'shmei akira. When you're home, outside of the Beis Hamikdash, you redefine a korban, that redefinition of the korban outside of the place of the korban doesn't matter. It doesn't count. It's not a valid place, a valid way to redefine the korban. Akira's chutz, the uprooting that's done, of changing this korban from what it was to what it's meant to be, and he does that outside of the Beis Hamikdash, that doesn't count as a korban. as a good uprooting, and therefore it's not valid. It's not a valid carbon right now. Kiyasa Ravin, when Ravin came, and again, Ravin also was one of those that would go from Babel to Eretz Israel and back and bring the teachings from one academy to the other. So Rav Dimi came. He said he quoted Rabbi Yirmiyah and his argument against Rabbi Yirmiyah. Or Rabbi Yirmiyah's response, no, this is an uprooting. It happened outside of the Beis Hamikdash, doesn't count. When Ravin came, Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, he quoted Rabbi Yirmiyah in the name of Rabbi Yochanan this way. Pesach sheshachtu b'chutz b'Shabbos Hashanah ben l'shmoi b'shalom l'shmoi chayiv. That carbon Pesach brought outside of Beis Hamikdash, regardless of whether you brought it intentionally as a carbon Pesach, and now it's not valid as a carbon Pesach today in the Beis Hamikdash, or whether you brought it as a shlamim outside of Beis Hamikdash, which it would be valid if you brought it in the Beis Hamikdash as a shlamim. Either way, you're held liable. Now, it's the other way around. First of all, that's not the way Rav Dimi quoted Rabbi Yirmiyah, but also the question is going to be: wait, today he brought it as a Pesach outside of the Beis Hamikdash. That's going to be held liable. If he brought it as a Pesach in the Beis Hamikdash, it's not a kosher korban, so it's not going to be valid. So why would he be held liable for bringing it outside of Beis Hamikdash? Even if he brought it to the Beis Hamikdash, it's not kosher. And even if he brought it as a Pesach Batanan, but we learned in the Mishnah, Mechuser Zman, if it's lacking time, meaning you have to wait until the correct time to bring this carbon, Bein Begufay. Whether it's the animal itself is not valid right now, meaning an animal can only be brought as a carbon after from its 8th day and on. The day that it's born or the week that it's born, you may not bring it as a carbon; it has to be left with its mother. So the animal is not valid yet in itself, or the one that's bringing the carbon, the person is not worthy of being of bringing the carbon right now. It's tameh, whatever it may be. There's time to wait. So whether you need to wait for the animal to be ready or for the owner to be ready, it's not going to count as a valid carbon because right now it's not valid. What is missing? When is it missing time? B'bailim for the owner. Hazav, hazava, the tumah of zav, that either male or female. Hayaledes, a woman to give birth. Hamatzora, a person that has leprosy. So another type of tumah. Whether that's included or not in the text correctly, on the side there is a note about it. They're already brought their chatas and their asham b'chutz outside of Beis Hamikdash. That's going to be potter. It's going to be exempt because they are not valid as a carbon yet because they can't be brought inside yet because their time has not yet come to bring their chatas and their asham, and it can't be brought as a gift because as a gift the chatas and asham sin offering can come as a gift. But their oila and their shlamim, which are just the scent offerings and peace offerings, which could come as a gift, even though that they haven't completed their tumah yet, and so their time hasn't come yet to bring it in the Beis Hamikdash for their purification process. But it is valid today as a gift, and so therefore that would count and would be valid. So what we see is that if the owner brings their obligatory carbon prior to the obligation coming, it's not going to be valid. But if they bring their obligatory carbon that could be redefined as a gift offering, even though it's prior to the obligation arriving, nevertheless they're going to be held liable because it is a valid carbon today as a gift, and therefore bringing it outside would be a transgression. Rav Chilkiah said this is only true if you brought it as the carbon that it's meant to be, because as the carbon that it's meant to be, the chatas, the asham, the sin offering, is not going to be valid in the Beis Hamikdash, and therefore you bringing it as a chatas, as a asham, and now it's not valid. That's going to be the problem, right? It's not valid as a chatas now because it's not the time yet. And you brought it as a chata. So if you had brought it in the Beis Hamikdash, it wouldn't count. So you're bringing it outside of the Beis Hamikdash, it doesn't count. However, if you brought it Shalei Lishma, you took this animal, which was intended to be a chatas, and you bring it as a shlamim, or you bring it as an oila outside of the Beis Hamikdash, which, if you bring a chatas as what it's meant to be, it would be invalid in the Beis Hamikdash. But if you brought it as a shlamim or as an oila in the Beis Hamikdash, and that's not what it was meant to be, it was meant to be a chatas, which at the time hadn't come yet. But you brought it as a shlamim, you brought it as a peace offering, and that can be brought in any day. So then it's going to count because it's roy lefnim. It is worthy of being brought in the Beis Hamikdash today, even though that it's not. You shouldn't do it because that's not what it's meant to be. But you brought it Shalei Lishma, not for its own sake. You're going to be chayiv. Because every carbon that you brought is going to be kosher, just doesn't fulfill the obligation, besides the carbon pesach. But all karbanas, achatas, which you brought as an oila, we've seen this many times now, even though that it's meant to be a sin offering. You brought it as an ascent offering or a peace offering, or oila or shlamim. It's going to count. It won't fulfill the obligation that the owner has to bring the sin offering, but it does count as a valid carbon. So therefore, if you had brought this to the Beis Hamikdash, it would be chayiv. You didn't bring it to the Beis Hamikdash, you shechted it would be valid. I mean, so you brought it, you shechted it at home, you're going to be chayiv, held liable. Lishmai, so now the Gemara concludes. However, if he had brought it as a chatas, what it was intended to be, miyapati is going to be exempt. Amai. Why? Nema, let us say, it's true that it is intended as a shlamim, intended as a chatas, as a sin offering, and as a sin offering, it's not valid yet because the time had not come. However, but we also said that if you had intended it as a oila, it's going to be valid, and so that means there's a hayil, which is the term for since I could bring it as something else, I should be held responsible, and that's the reasoning that Ravin just said by the Korban Pesach that that even if you brought it as a Korban Pesach, it's going to be you're going to be held liable because since you could have brought it as a shlamim, so too over here you could have brought it as a shlamim, so you should be held liable. This Ravin says the complete opposite of what we said before. In Rav Chisda and Rabbah, we said that the Korban Pesach requires an uprooting. Why? Because the Korban Pesach is moving from Pesach to Shlamim, whereas the Chatas, the goat, switching to the Musaf, both of them are going to be a Chatas offering. You're moving it from Chatas. Chatas doesn't require uprooting. Here, Ravin says the other way around, that actually the Korban Pesach does not require an uprooting. Because as we said, Pesach is in the Shlavim family. So you're bringing it as a Shlavim, that's a natural fit for it. It doesn't require that you uproot it. But the Chatas, the sin offering, that this person is bringing for their the end of their Tumah process, and they're going to bring it as an Oila, as a scent offering, that's an entirely different carbon. One is a sin offering for a particular moment, for a particular tshuva process. And the other, the ascent offering, can be brought as a gift. It's an independent carbon, and therefore that requires uprooting. And unless you intended it, it's not going to. Ravashi Masnechayev Kedamrina. Ravashi said that that is obligated, like Ravin just said. However, Rav Yirmiyah Medifti Masni Pater, Rav Yirmiyah Medifti, he says, like Rav Dimi, that it will be exempt. So we now have two opinions in the name of Rabbi Yirmiyah and the name of Rabbi Yochanan on whether someone who brought a carbon pesach, not in its time, whether with intent or without intent, as a carbon pesach, out and shechted it at home, whether that counts as a carbon or not. We have Rav Dimi saying that either way they're going to be exempt. Ravin says either way they're going to be held liable, and Rav Ashi agrees with Ravin, and Rav Yirmiyah Difti he agrees with Rav Dimi. Kasava Pesach b'Shai Masashana b'Yakira, because they follow the first reasoning that we saw in the name of Chisda, that a Korban Pesach, the rest of the year, will require an uprooting. If you want to change it from a Korban Pesach to Shlomim, even though that it is in the family of Shlomim, but Shlomim is a different Korban than Pesach, so if you want to change it from its original designation and bring it as a Shlomim, it requires intent. It requires, not intent, an uprooting. You have to change it. And it's going to be exempt because when you change it outside of the Beis HaMikdash, it's not valid. It's not the place that you bring this korban, so that doesn't count. And this disagrees with Rav Chilkiah Bar Tuvi, which we just saw, which had said that the korban Pesach automatically becomes a shlomim. It is in the family; it doesn't require an uprooting, and therefore it's going to be held liable. And the person will be held liable for bringing it outside. Amar Ma. So we had just said, going back to the goats. He shechted the goats outside of the Beis HaMikdash on Yom Kippur. Terrible thing just happened. Right? It's meant to be in the Beis HaMikdash, meant to be brought as the sin offering. The girl had already been done, the lottery had been done. One had been designated as the goat Lashem, as the atonement that's going to be brought inside and spritzed in the Holy of Holies, and the other, the Sarah Lazaz, are going to go out to the desert and carry the sins of Israel. And if he the one that he shechted that could have been the korban, the chatas, the sin offering, that he's going to be liable for shechting outside of the proper place in the Beis HaMikdash. And for the one that's going down Zazel is going to be exempt because after all, that's not a korban, that's just going out. Tanar Rabbanan, the Brisa thought. Ish mi beis Yisrael. Any person of the house of Yisrael, asher yishkat, that will shecht. Shoyer, a kesev, a eis, a bull, a lamb, a goat in the camp. Or shechts it outside of the camp, whether at home or anywhere else. And he didn't bring it to the tent of Hashem, and to the tent of meaning, to the Oil to the Beis HaMikdash, to bring the korban of Hashem. Now we turn to the Gemara and Samachim Olametes. So now we're going to make a drasha, which we said, up until now we said, it has to be that it is worthy of being brought as a korban, right? Because it said you didn't bring it to the Beis HaMikdash as a korban Hashem, meaning you should have. But if it's not valid, then you couldn't have. So that would not be the transgression. It has to be that it could have brought it. Now, the term korban lashem generally would mean, even if it's not brought as a korban, but rather for its monetary value. I may have thought, even if it was never really intended as a korban, but rather this animal was donated for its monetary value for the upkeep of the Beis HaMikdash. So that's called kache bedek habayis, sanctified for the bedek habayis, the upkeep of the building, meaning for its monetary value. Shenikru korban, because that also is called a korban. Kenyan shenema v'nikrav as korban, v'nikrav as korban Hashem. V'nakri as korban Hashem, and it bring close the korban of Hashem. Each person what he finds, and there it says vessels of gold, etc. And there it's clearly talking about in monetary value, the korban Hashem. Therefore, the end of the pasuk says, and he didn't bring it to the door, the opening of the Beis HaMikdash. Meaning it was worthy and should have been brought to the opening, and he didn't. Therefore, he's going to be held liable for shechting it outside because he could have and should have brought it to the Beis HaMikdash. But if it's not worthy, even if he had brought it to the Beis HaMikdash, it would not have counted as a korban. So then you can't hold him liable because even if he had brought it, it would not be valid. So bringing it outside did not transgress this prohibition of not bringing it to the Beis HaMikdash. Ein chayavin Allah bachutz. So therefore, he's not going to be held liable for bringing outside. And the Brisa says, Oitzi, therefore, I will exclude those that are not worthy of being brought to the opening of the Beis Hamikdash. And I will not exclude the bull of the sin offering, which the text over here, Rashi has a problem with. It says the bull of the offering does require Beis Hamikdash. So Rashi takes it out. Tosfos has a lengthy explanation of why it could be included. Either way, the bull of Chatas, V'sara Mishalech, and that's really what we need over here is this second term, which is for sure part of the text. And it says, and the goat that sent out to the desert, that's going to be included. That if you shecht it, you're going to be held liable. Why? Because it is worthy of being brought to the Pesach. Oh, really? It's worthy of being brought to the door? No, it's not meant to be brought in all. You're intending to send it out into the desert. Yeah, but it also says korban lashem, a korban for Hashem. It has to be that it's intended as a korban to Hashem, and this is not korban lashem, or rather it's sent as a goat out to the desert. So anything that's intended as a korban lashem, that needs to be able to be brought as a korban lashem. Anything that's meant as an offering, as a bringing close to Hashem in the Beis Hamikdash, so that has to be available to be brought to the Beis Hamikdash. If now's not the right time, you're not going to be held liable. But the Sha'ar La'azazel is never meant to be a korban Lashem. It doesn't have to be brought as a offering to Hashem in the Beis Hamikdash. Therefore, if you shecht it outside, you're going to be held liable because it doesn't have the exemption of the necessity to be able to be brought Lashem, because it never is brought Lashem. But now the Gemara is going to challenge that and say, is that really an exemption or a broadening of the sense? And that's going to exclude the Sarah Mishalech to say that you are held liable for shechting it outside. Actually, we're out of time. Okay, so tomorrow we'll continue with this question of the goat being sent out. Is that really a more included on account of it not